welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Katie, I'm a mixed media artist, and in today's video I'm going to be talking all about pencils. So I recently bought a set of 100 Faber Castell Polychromos pencils, which you can see here in the fancy mahogany box. And I also have a collection of the Prismacolor Premier pencils, which I started with, and I've slowly been building up my Caran Luminance collection too. So because I have quite a selection of coloured pencils, I thought it would be really interesting to compare them and talk about the pros and cons for each of the pencils and really do a direct comparison. So we're going to be doing some experiments for blending and hardness to see what the leads are like, and swatching them all as well. If you are looking at buying some coloured pencils, I really hope this video is helpful. I know that there is a huge range out there and I'm only comparing these three, but I really hope that it does help, and let's jump into our comparisons. So first up, I just want to mention the type of pencils these are. Now these are all, I would say, in the higher end. You can obviously get a lot cheaper coloured pencils, but to me you can really tell the difference between a good quality and a bad quality pencil. Now both the Prismacolor and the Luminance are wax-based pencils, whereas the Polychromos is oil-based, and that just means that the first two are slightly softer, and because of the oil base of the Polychromos it's slightly harder, and you'll see that with my swatches and my experiments later on. Pricing wise, I actually thought they were all at a similar sort of level, but actually the Luminance is a lot pricier than the other two, and the Polychromos and the Prismacolor are kind of on par. I wanted to show the prices that are available here in the UK. Now I do know that Prismacolor is definitely widely available in the US, whereas I think for the rest of the world it's a lot harder to find. You can't buy them open stock here, or at least I haven't found a website that you can, so you have to buy them in sets. Whereas you can buy individual pencils and build up your collection slowly with the Luminance and the Polychromos. For me, that's a really big plus for those brands because I usually never recommend buying a huge set of something. I always recommend buying just a couple of a particular art supply and seeing how they work, if you enjoy using them, and how they fit into your general art practice. Because I think going all out and buying a big set of something that you don't know if you like is a waste of money if you end up not liking it. So I always recommend starting slowly and buying just a couple of them and then building up your collection that way. If you did like it, then you can buy a set, but it's just not an option here with the Prismacolors, so I think that's something worth bearing in mind if you are in the UK. So I've been able to compare the prices for the individual pencils for the Luminance and the Polychromos, but not for the Prismacolor. One Caran Luminance pencil will set you back £3.40, so that's £3.40 per pencil, and a set of 20 costs about £60. I don't have the individual Prismacolor price, but a set of 24 is around £30. And then the Polychromos, one individual Polychromos pencil is £1.80, so almost half of the Luminance, and then a set of 24 Polychromos is £25. So actually the Polychromos comes in at our lowest, and I'll put these all on screen so you can compare them. The Luminance is definitely a lot pricier, so we'll see if it's worth that when we do our swatching and our experiments. So now I've covered the price and availability, let's go on to the testing and swatching in my sketchbook. This video will have chapters, so if you want to jump ahead to a specific experiment, you'll find those all down below and in the description box, where I've also linked the products too. Okay, so now the swatching has been done, it's time to do some more specific tests to compare the pencils. And one of the things that I find with coloured pencils is the difference in their hardness and like the strength of the lead. And it was quite interesting when I was swatching these because I did notice that. I feel like that's the main difference between cheap pencils and more expensive ones. Now, all of these I would say are definitely on the higher end of coloured pencils, as I mentioned in the intro, so I'm expecting them to be quite similar. But let's do a proper comparison test on our page. So let's call this the hardness test. And I just want to see how hard I can press them and also how light. I'm going to do a couple of different pencils because I do find that it changes. When I was swatching some of these, it felt like some of the colours weren't coming out as strong as the others, and I think that's just because of the pigments in the lead, so obviously that is going to differ. So I'll pick 3 from each and include some dark, light and medium values, and we'll see how they go. So we'll start with the Luminance. Let's pick a dark blue for this one. And I use Luminance a lot. I know I can really press hard and get a huge amount of pigment. We are getting a few little bits of colour down, so again I noticed that when I was swatching. And we'll do a light one for this colour. So you can be quite soft with these. Let's pick a pink mid shade. These feel really soft and buttery, but you can be really, really hard with them and get quite a lot of that pigment down on the page. That's generally how I use them. I mostly use them for like my details layer. And then let's pick a cream colour for our light shade. And I'll try and match these values with the other pencils as well. So I can press really hard. I did get a few little bits of shaving from the lead. So this was for the Luminance. And we'll do the same for the Prismacolor. I don't have a super dark blue, so I'm just going to pick the darkest one I've got. These feel very similar. There's a bit less of the lead sort of coming off, there's a lot less of the pigment, so I think that's quite interesting. The lead is a lot thinner as well, so I'll do a test on that. And a neutral shade. So it's not quite as creamy as the Luminance. But they perform very, very similar. I can press really hard. There's a few little bits of sort of dust coming off, but not as big as the Luminance. And I'd definitely say that they are very on par. So that is the Prismacolor. And then last up, let's do the Faber Castell Polychromos. So a little bit of the lead coming up. I do find that these smudge a little bit more. Yeah, the other ones don't really smudge at all. This one feels like there's some pigment sort of laying on the top that you can then smudge further, and it comes up on your finger. So like if you are creating and you're smudging with your hand, I think that the Faber Castell Polychromos will smudge a lot more than the other two, so they feel a lot harder. So interestingly, I feel like this is a slightly different feel as well to it. Doesn't feel quite as soft. And we'll do our pink. So that was the Polychromos. The next thing I want to test is the line thickness. So let's get all three of our blues. So here they are. Let's just call this one line. So I'm going to press really as hard as I can with this, and then do as thin as I can with this. I went a bit close there, but that's alright. Then we'll move on to the Luminance. So I feel like that's thicker than that first one, but similar with the thin line. So that's the Luminance, and then the Polychromos. So you can see there what I felt when I was swatching it. It's a lot less thick. So this is the Polychromos, and thin again. So I feel like you can press harder on these two. Let's do another little test. Yeah, there's definitely a difference there. So hopefully that's coming up on camera, but like these feel a lot softer, which I think is really interesting. So like even when the lead is slightly worn down, I think it's harder on the Polychromos to sort of get that thickness. So that's quite interesting because they obviously do have that hardness, and like I did notice when I was swatching them, like especially on some of these colours, it felt different. It's quite interesting, the difference there. I'm very used to the Luminance, which obviously gives me that really thick line, and then I obviously have to keep on sharpening. And sharpening is one of the things that I found with the Prismacolors. When I used to use those, there was some where the lead snapped a lot, so let's do a sharpening test next. Let's pick some different colours. Let's pick a nice lime green. So I'll get those from all my pencil packs. So this is the colour that we're going to be testing. I'm going to sharpen them to a point. Obviously this one's not been used, so I'm going to leave that one, but I'll sharpen the other two. And then I want to scribble as much as I can to blunt it down, and we'll see how quickly it gets blunt. And then I'll see how they sharpen as well. My sharpener of choice is the Derwent Pastel and Charcoal Sharpener. I really like this for really sharp points on my lead. It also does fit the pencil sizes in, because I would say when we compare, the Luminance is definitely the thickest. So you can see the Prismacolor is the thinnest. And actually the Polychromos is quite similar, but I'd say it's a few millimeters smaller than the Luminance. Okay, so let's start with our Luminance. I'm just going to scribble. You can definitely see there where a lot of the pigment is coming off. I can feel that some side of the nib is getting worn down a lot. There's quite a lot coming off here, so whereas I found that the Polychromos would smudge a lot, this one would get a lot of pigment on, but I wouldn't say it's smudging much at all. The pigment's really settled into the paper. So I'm just going over and over. It's getting a nice texture. You can really see here just how much that's worn down, so it's quite a soft nib, and if I move off some of this pigment, you can see that it doesn't take much, so I do find that I do go through these Luminance quite quickly. So Prismacolor next. Slightly less olivey, this one, than the Luminance. Again, you can see a little bit of the lead coming off on the page, but not as much. This is definitely wearing down a little bit less quickly, but it doesn't take very long. There's definitely less shavings on here, and again, it's not really smudging. Here's how the lead is looking now. And then last up, the Polychromos. So this is the brightest green I've got in the Polychromos. So again, it's kind of a yellow. It sits with the yellows. It's not as green as the other two. I'm getting a little bit of powder off, not in as big chunks as the top ones. This is definitely taking longer to sort of push down. So like again, that hardness from the line tests is coming in to play. So I feel like I've been pushing as much as the other one, and I've been doing it for about the same amount of time. It's definitely harder because I can see the indentations on the page, which is quite interesting. the other two I can't see that because they are softer lead. So I would say the Polychromos is the hardest of the three. This is how much this one has worn down. I'd say that was a very similar amount of time. So it's not as much as the others, definitely a harder lead. I'm just going to wear this down to the same amount as the others, and then we can do a fair sharpening test. Okay, so I've worn that down now. I would say that they're all at a very similar sharpness now. So you can see that there. And let's see how they sharpen. So I've just got my little bowl here, and I'm going to sharpen straight into that with my dough inch sharpener. So we'll do the Luminance first. That sharpens really nicely. It's a very clean sharpen, like you can see all the way around. It's really smooth lead, and there's been no issues with sharpening that. Next up, the Prismacolor. This one's quite interesting because you can see the roughness of the lead there. It's not as smooth all the way around. And I did find with my Prismacolor that some of them, the lead was broken in the barrel of the pencil, and so I did find that a few of them snapped really quickly. I had a specific green that did that, whereas I haven't found that at all with the Luminance. And I think you can see the difference with the lead there compared to the Luminance, how it is a little bit rougher and not as smooth. And now for the Polychromos. So again, a really strong lead. It's quite smooth all the way around again. It's a little bit on that side, but not as much as the Prismacolor. So really strong leads. I'm really impressed with how sharp of a point we can get, and without any issues. But like I said, I did find some issues with the Prismacolor. I obviously haven't used the Polychromos as much, but because the lead feels a lot harder, I think that there wouldn't be an issue with the sharpening. But all the lead seems really good quality. Okay, so let's do a blending test next. I'm going to pick a few colours from each of them. Let's start with the Luminance. So this is for blending. So I'm going to start with a yellow, and then I'll move to an orange. Maybe the light green can come in, and then to a light blue. So I'm just going to go back and forth to try and blend the colours together, and I'll do that on all of them to make it a fair test. So that's working quite nicely actually. It is softening as I go over it. Now this is going into green, which isn't a natural colour for it to blend into. You can definitely see the pigment coming up there, and we'll blend that into a light blue. So I feel like they do blend really nicely. Obviously I've picked different colours there just to see how it does merge. And you can see that this kind of picks up a bit of the colour. So I'm quite impressed with that. I don't often blend with my coloured pencils, so this isn't a test that I would usually use. Like I said, I usually just use them for line work and details. So this is the Luminance. Let's do the exact same on the Prismacolor and the Polychromos. Did you see that? So this lead is definitely not as hard as the Luminance, even though that feels soft, and I don't think it's as hard as the Polychromos, but it's definitely more brittle, and I have found that in the past when I was sharpening, like I mentioned. So I wouldn't say it's blending it as much. I think it takes a little bit more work than the Luminance above. It's also sort of picking up the colour, so you can definitely see that on the camera, where it might be my stock, but this, I'm doing it the same as the one above, and it didn't do this with the Luminance. So that's interesting. And we'll end on the light blue, which is slightly darker than the one above. This is the lightest blue I have in my collection. So I would say that the Luminance probably blends nicer than Prismacolor. I have seen reviews of this and it comes up really high, so it could just be my lack of experience, but I feel like this is a lot smoother than this. I think it works better up here, obviously where the yellow would go into the orange. The orange to the green didn't work as well. And last up, let's do the Polychromos. That's looking a little bit more yellow. Obviously it's a yellower tone, so I'm just going to add in a bit of green on top. And then we'll go into our blue. Okay, so there's our Polychromos. Although it is a harder lead, it does still blend nicely, but you can sort of see the lines in blending, so it takes more work to blend. And again, I think with other stock it would probably be easier, but this is a like-for-like test, and I would say that the others did better. Luminance definitely comes on top for me because the Prismacolor, it was interesting with the orange and the green, which doesn't naturally go into each other. How it was kind of taking off some of that top pigment. I would say that it took more work to blend. Whereas the Luminance, definitely the softest lead out of all the three, even though obviously it is quite tight between them. Out of the three, this is the softest, and I found it a lot easier to blend. But obviously the nib does wear down quicker, so that's a pro and a con, because I feel like you're constantly having to then sharpen them, so you're having to buy and replace them more. Certainly more often than these two, because obviously it takes a lot longer to wear down the nib on the Polychromos. I think with the Polychromos it helps to have more colours to obviously blend them more seamlessly, and it's the same with the others. Obviously the more shades you have, the easier it is to blend, but this was quite an interesting comparison, I think. And now our last test is going to be layering. So I'm going to put down some gouache and some acrylic paint just here and let them dry, and we'll come back. Okay, so I've put down a cadmium yellow hue in the acrylic paint and then ultramarine in gouache. These are both dry now, and I'm going to do a light tone, a dark tone in blue for all of the brands, and then I'll also do a white and a black. So here are my shades of blue. We'll start with the Luminance again. So I use my Luminance over paint quite a lot. So those are the lighter ones, and I think it's interesting to see how it does over a darker tone as well. So there's no issue there. You can definitely see a difference in tone there on the darker gouache, so that's quite interesting. Then the Prismacolor, again with the light blue, not an issue there. Slightly darker than the Luminance, and a dark blue. Oops, that's the wrong one. Oh, that's quite nicely, that's layering really well. Dark, not so much again. I feel like that's really not coming through. And we'll do the same on the Polychromos. So it's kind of blending in a bit with the yellow there. And it's not layering as well over there. So I'll do some close-ups here because I feel like you can really see how scratchy the Polychromos is. The light blue on the Polychromos on the yellow isn't as light blue. I feel like the Luminance wins there. Obviously it's slightly different tone, but this one kind of looks more green, whereas in comparison, like, you can see the actual colour of it there. So that's that one, so that's kind of similar. There's the Luminance, and then the Polychromos. This blue looks totally different to how it's sitting on the acrylic. The dark tones have done pretty well, I'd say, but there's a big difference on the gouache. So with the lighter tones, the Polychromos didn't sit on top at all. You can barely see that there's anything there. The Luminance, I'd say, is the winner, and then we've got the Prismacolor, which is similar to the Luminance. And then darker tone, so I feel like all of them were quite dark tones. It will be interesting with the white and black. Again, Luminance is showing up less so with the Prismacolor, and I feel like the only reason we can see the Polychromos is because it's dented into the paint. So again, you can see the hardness coming through there because you can see the pencil lines rather than the colour. So I feel like that's a good test, and now we're going to do the white and the black from each. So I don't have a pure white or a pure black Luminance, that's the only thing. So I'm going to use what I've got, which is the closest. So for me, that is the pink white, which is 581, and the dark indigo 639. These are the darkest shades I have in the Luminance. Then I've got a white and a black Prismacolor. You can definitely see a difference there in which one gets used more. And I'll also pick a white and a black from the Polychromos. So let's see how these fare. So Luminance first. I think lighter colours do struggle, obviously it's on a light colour anyway. The dark definitely doesn't. So there's obviously a difference. The darker colour obviously shows up much better on the lighter background, but I am impressed with how much it shows on the blue as well, and really like how the white layers on top of the darker tone compared to the one on the yellow. Now for the Prismacolor. Really nicely. I think these are slightly waxy. I will put on screen what they're made of. So I would say, obviously that was a pink white, but this has done really well. I prefer the white of the Prismacolor on the yellow, and then the dark tones have worked really nicely. Really impressed with how the white's layered on there as well. And then last up, the Polychromos. This sort of test works better with the softer nibs. So there's the white. Not too bad, you are seeing it, but again it's sort of indenting because the lead is harder. The white shows up really well, much better than the light blue, so that's definitely brought it back in line with the others, where I'd say this blue made it not as good. This one is much better. And then the black, really nice. Yeah, definitely works really well there, so it's definitely comparable. I would say that the white, obviously you can see the lines a little bit more. I think that the Prismacolor wins that test because it's softer and it blends in better. But they all fare out really well, and I don't think there's any issues there. So I think that was some really helpful and interesting tests. I obviously haven't tested everything, I haven't had every single colour shade of each of the brands, but let's go to the outro now and we'll do a little summary of how this video has gone. So I found that a really interesting experiment, and I could kind of tell the differences in the pencils when I was just doing the swatches, and the experiments definitely reinforced my thoughts. So the Luminance is obviously the most expensive, and I think with really good reason. I absolutely love the softness of them, but also the vibrancy that you can get. You don't have to press too hard, but I would say that the only con with these is that because the lead is so soft, you wear them down a lot quicker, and so you go through them quicker. And that's not very helpful when they are so expensive, but they're still going to be my go-to of choice. I really do love my Prismacolors. As you can tell by my set, they are very well loved, but because they're not open stock and I can't just replace one of the colours, they've kind of been replaced in my collection by the Luminance for that reason. I think they were really impressive with their blending and the way that they work. They are soft like the Luminance, but not quite as soft. I think this is a really good option for coloured pencils, and I do think that the set of 24 is a really good starting set too. And then the Polychromos, so this was something that I was coming into because I've only recently got those. I really like having that huge colour range, but they are actually a lot harder than I thought they'd be. I think because I'm so used to a soft pencil with the Luminance and Prismacolor, it's going to take a little bit of getting used to. I feel like it needed a little bit more work with blending and also pressing harder because they are oil based. I think for the price, which is £1.80, they're definitely a great pencil, and they're also really easily available, so that's a definite win. I was also impressed with how they layered, so the whites in all of these were pretty similar on top of the darker paint, and I do think when I was swatching them they all felt really nice to use, and I can definitely see why these three pencils are really popular for most artists. So I hope this video was helpful and that you've learned something about the coloured pencils. If you were looking to buy them, I hope that this has helped answer some of your questions, and if you do have any more questions or want to ask me something specific to test, then please do let me know down in the comments and I will do that for you. A huge thank you for watching, and a big thank you to my patrons for allowing me to continue to put out this free content and still be a full-time artist, because without their support I wouldn't be able to do that. I hope you have a great week, and I will see you next Sunday with a new YouTube video. See you later!